it may be possible for the host to turn Jim's video on and off too, if he can't do it on his phone.
Yes. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Mansfield Dialogue on Rights and Responsibilities in a Time of COVID. The Mansfield Center was endowed by an act of Congress in 1983 to carry forward Mike Mansfield's legacy of statesmanship, ethics, and civility in public affairs. The center's goal is to foster a national dialogue of respect and civility to support trust in our national institutions, our founding documents, and our public policymakers. We foster civil exchanges of ideas from diverse viewpoints, reinforce the importance of democratic institutions, and examine the role that ethical values play in public life. Our pandemic dialogues that we've been hosting serve this mission by bringing community together to discuss critical issues that have arisen during the course of the pandemic. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the Project on American Democracy and Citizenship, as well as the Justice, Policy, and Public Service Community of Excellence. We are also offering this through Missoula Community Access Television through one of their generous public access grants. I'm honored to briefly introduce today's speakers. They have their full bios on our website if you'd like to check out the full breadth of their experience and education. I'll start with Anna Conley, the Chief Civil Deputy in the Missoula County Attorney's Office. In that capacity, she represents the Missoula City County Health Department and Board of Health. Jim Nelson served as a justice on the Montana Supreme Court from 1993 until 2013. Tom Snyder is the owner of the restaurant 5 on Black with a location here in Missoula and others around the state, as he tries to create a sustainable and living wage for his 100 employees, as well as a positive impact in their home communities. House Majority Leader Sue Vinton is currently serving her third term in the Montana legislature, representing House District 56 in Yellowstone County. She also works with her husband at their general contracting business, Vinton Construction, Inc. I'll now turn it over to our moderator, law professor Anthony Johnstone, who teaches and writes about federal and state constitution law, legislation, election law, and jurisprudence. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Thank you, Dina, and welcome everyone to this important Mansfield Dialogue, part of a series of dialogues on the COVID pandemic in Montana and our communities. I'd like to just set the table a little bit here. Thank you to everyone at the Mansfield Center for hosting and all your work behind the scenes. I'll steal a little of Justice Nelson's thunder. He quoted this in one of his op-eds on this subject, but the Montana Constitution really sets forth the kind of rights and responsibility harmonization that our communities and our leaders are engaged in right now. Article 2 of the Montana Constitution, our Declaration of Rights, Section 3, talks about how all persons are born free and have certain inalienable rights. And then it goes forth to talk about them. They include the right to a clean and healthful environment and the rights of pursuing life's basic necessities, enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and seeking their safety, health, and happiness in all lawful ways. Enjoying these rights, all persons recognize corresponding responsibilities. In this context, these words describe the ultimate duty of government to protect our inalienable natural rights in community, rights that we could not enjoy if we did not have the structure of government and its laws to organize our society. Those rights must be enjoyed subject to the limitations of their enjoyment by others. So your property, you have a right to enjoy your property until it interferes with my health, and so on and so forth. That's where we get these calls for government to harmonize and balance these rights by restricting them to all lawful ways and by imposing on we, the citizens of Montana, corresponding responsibilities. It's this tricky balancing process, this way of harmonizing our rights and responsibilities under this public health crisis that we're working through, that has also become an economic crisis and has impacted all of our lives in unprecedented ways, that is the subject of our discussion. The other two things I want to put on the table just as we start as background is, and this will be familiar to my students from constitutional law, is the two primary constitutional frameworks for understanding where we are and where we're going in this pandemic. First, the respective powers of federal, state, and local laws and officials, as well as our legislators and judges. So the federal response to the pandemic largely relies on spending and regulatory authority that's been provided to the president and his administration under a state of emergency. And those are laws that are passed by Congress. The state's state of emergency actually piggybacks in important ways on the federal state of emergency. And that state of emergency authorizes the governor with further powers to modify regulations and reallocate state resources in the interest of emergency response. All of this, I should say, the local response, and we're going to hear about that too, the local response to public health emergency is supported by the state response, but also relies on its frontline public health authority provided by law. It does not depend on a state of emergency declared by the president or the governor, but instead is an essential part of what we ask our counties to do to protect public health. All of this is structured by federal and state legislation that's rarely been invoked at this scale for this duration, which raises a lot of questions about what the right rules and balancing are. Secondly, those are the powers. The rights implicated is that in general, the federal and state constitutions empower government to preserve and promote the general welfare or public health within certain delegated or restrained powers. Talked about that, but both constitutions also have lists of specific guarantees such as freedom of speech and free exercise of religion, equal protection of the laws, due process when government deprives anyone of their life, liberty, or property, and other protections. These rights so far in this crisis have been invoked in relatively narrow circumstances so far, due largely to a long history of judicial deference to accountable and expert officials in important matters of public health, and also due to the general respect those officials show in their actions for these common rights when they're responding to our public health concerns. Now on to more specific questions of balancing. And to start us off, I'd like to turn to Justice Nelson. Can you say more about how we ought to balance these rights and responsibilities in our current public health emergency?
Yeah, I can. And thanks, Professor John Stone. I'd like to note in 1985, Gabriel Marquet, a Nobel Prize-winning Colombian author, published his novel, Love in a Time of Cholera. A generation later, today, we come together to discuss rights and responsibilities in a time of COVID. But in this time, nobody is feeling the love. I've written 2 op-eds on the subject, which were published in state newspapers and various blogs. The first one, referred to in your materials, argued that while many patriots and anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and other self-proclaimed experts are very vocal in expressing their rights, notably their rights to freedom from government interference in their lives and liberty, and speech, and to possess guns, most are clueless about Montana's constitutional imperative, referred to by Professor John Stone, for responsible citizenship. That is under Article 2, Section 3 of the Montana Constitution, with the exercise of inalienable rights come, and I quote, corresponding responsibilities, unquote. The second article published a few weeks ago, I guess it was, argued that the constitutional imperative for responsible citizenship also applied to those men and women, all of whom who have sworn to support, protect, and defend the Constitution, who are presently sitting in session as legislators in our state capitol. These public officials are tasked with the constitutional duty to offer, debate, and ultimately enact laws which they undoubtedly expect that we, the people, will obey. Sadly, however, a substantial majority of these legislators have forsworn their corresponding responsibilities to follow national and local COVID directives, to wear face coverings, to physical distance, and to meet virtually to the extent possible. My point in both op-eds is that responsible citizens not only enjoy and exercise their rights guaranteed under Montana's Constitution, but, and as Professor Johnstone noted as well, recognize their corresponding responsibilities. Those being simply to value, respect, and facilitate their neighbors' exercise of their sometimes complementary and sometimes competing rights. But there's another aspect of this subject that I touched on in my first op-ed, to those who proclaim the government can't tell me what to do, I'm not going to wear a mask or distance, I know my rights. Well, I will tell those people and those who believe that the government can do precisely that. Globally, that authority goes under the rubric of the rule of law, but more specifically, that power is part and parcel of government's police powers, and these are recognized in both federal and Montana constitutional law. Basically, police powers comprise the state's ability, and its duty really, to regulate the behavior and enforce order within its territory for the betterment of the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of its inhabitants. These powers are exercised by executive and legislative branches of government, and states have the power to compel obedience through appropriate measures, including legal sanctions, physical means, and other forms of coercion and inducement, even if these conflict with individual rights and freedoms. Indeed, in a 2018 decision, Nelson versus the City of Billings, the Montana Supreme Court, quoting the framers of our Constitution, stated, and I quote, "All rights have to be balanced against the police power," end quote. So, bottom line, we all enjoy constitutional rights, but with those go corresponding responsibilities. The latter, not only a constitutional imperative, but as well enforceable as part of the government's constitutional police powers. In short, those who know their rights should practice their corresponding responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Nelson. Let's turn now to Anna Conley, who has been one of our frontline officials advising Missoula County on all of the difficult questions that arise. Share some of those questions and maybe some answers with us, Anna.
Thank you, Anthony. So as a civil deputy in the Missoula County Attorney's Office, I have a statutory duty under state law to act as the legal representative for the Missoula City County Health Department. I've done that for the last 4 years. Prior to coming to work as a government attorney for Missoula, I actually sued the government as an ACLU attorney, and I was also in private practice. I've also taught civil liberties both in our Bill of Rights and in international human rights law, both here in the US and in other countries. So I am a big proponent of the sacred bedrock foundation of civil liberties and what it plays for our democracy. The first few years that I worked for the health department, most of what I did was environmental health regulation. So for example, if you have a piece of property in Missoula County, making sure that your well is a sufficient distance from your wastewater drain field and from your neighbor's well that you're going to be able to drink safe water, for example. Also doing air regulation, helping with making sure that our air shed stays safe with regard to burning, water quality issues with regard to the Clark Fork, also assisting the health department with regard to licensed establishments such as restaurants to make sure that if you take your family out to eat, you know that you're going to be eating safe food at a restaurant here in town. Of course, the health officer and the health board have a statutory duty to stop the spread of communicable disease. I've heard a lot about this being like a discretionary authority, but it's not. It's a duty with the word shall in state law. This is something that our local folks have to do, whether they want to or not, or whether it's hard or easy. So about a year ago, when we first knew that we were going to be dealing with a pandemic and having to really start operating under that duty of stopping the spread of communicable disease, we took a lot of steps right away. One of the first steps I took is making sure that I understood the contours of allowable state power in an isolation and quarantine context. And as Anthony pointed out, there's actually really broad authority under existing state decisions from our Supreme Court. That being said, we really did want to draw some lines in the sand right away. One was we wanted to make sure that we weren't detaining people in our jail for violation of isolation and quarantine orders. We wanted to keep our jail free from COVID, not only for civil liberties reasons, but also for public health reasons. Luckily, we had a non-congregate shelter in the Sleepy Inn where we could house people who didn't otherwise have a place to isolate and quarantine and had been ordered to do so. We also had to start thinking about privacy right away. Of course, privacy is one of the most important rights in Montana, and everyone, employers, media, wanted to know about testing status of others. And we'd made a decision early on that we were going to have gold standard privacy protections for individuals who are isolated or quarantined. And then we had to start dealing with restrictions. And really, the health officer followed the science and the health board followed the science. It's not a surprise to me because we really were relying on data from day one that pretty much every time Missoula County issued a directive, the governor would follow up with a similar directive in the coming days or weeks. For example, Missoula County was the first county to close bars and have takeout only in March of last year. And then subsequently, the governor followed up with a similar order. In July, we had our mask mandate. We were the first county to require that. The next week, it was required at the state level. When we were thinking about our mask mandate, we had two options. One was to make it an individual mandate, you must wear a mask, or the other was the option that we chose, which is if you have an indoor public space, you must require masks to stop the spread of communicable disease in that space. And we took that option because we felt it was more protective of people's freedom to not wear a mask. You don't need to wear a mask in Missoula County unless you're employed in an indoor space or want to get your goods or services in an indoor space. We know that that put a burden on licensed establishment owners, and we had to think hard about how to approach that. And then the governor took the same approach, and then the recent governor directive also took the same approach that exists now. I think then you saw the same thing in November when we had our November spike and we had to make the hard decision to have an earlier closing time for bars. And then a week and a half later, the governor did the same thing. So I think that our proactiveness and our following the science is really why we have the lowest per capita cases of any urban county in Montana. And I think it's something that we can be really proud of because I think we've really operated as safely and responsibly and reasonably as we can. People are very upset and obsessed with enforcement of these regulations. It's interesting to me because so much of what I was thinking about early on was involuntary isolation and quarantine and privacy, and we worked so hard to protect those rights, and that really hasn't been recognized by the community. Instead, there's just been this really obsession with enforcement. I think a lot of people don't realize how much resource goes into the front end of giving resources, giving education, really trying to make sure that people, that businesses understand what is required of them in their space. We know that we've had lots of changes as we've needed to adjust things based on data, science, and the epidemiological situation in our county. But that enforcement piece that people really want to focus on is just a tiny little piece of so many resources and so much effort that's gone into trying to stop the spread of COVID. I will say that starting in April, when at the federal level, public health became a really polarized issue, we started to have what was a very, very, very difficult job become, quite frankly, a traumatic job for our local health folks. They started getting threats. They started getting hostile messages, voicemails, being called Nazis, being called names I'm not going to restate here. And really, it seemed to stem from this idea that there were unelected bureaucrats that were making a power grab. This was their chance to exercise power. And I can tell you that there's no one that's more excited about these restrictions going away than the people who have had to implement them, adjust them, and enforce them. There's been no power grab. There's been people working as hard as they can to get to comply with the statutory duty that has been assigned to them. Significant thought goes into each and every word of every regulation. Significant effort goes into not having to enforce the regulations. And if we do have to enforce them, doing it in a really fair way. I can say personally, it's been really hard to watch the dynamic of the last year, because I have been an attorney for this group of people that have worked 7 days a week in incredibly difficult scenarios, trying as hard as they can to keep our communities safe, and really being met with resistance and hostility and criticism. It's really easier to criticize than to act proactively in trying to come up with how to manage a pandemic that none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. I've had sanitarians that I work with have to flee from licensed establishment inspections, afraid for their physical safety, trying to get out of the parking lot as quick as they can. And I'm just really sad about that lack of civil discourse. And so that's why I'm really glad and happy to participate today, because I think we need to get back to civil discourse and get back to treating each other with respect, even if there are concerns about how things are being handled. I'm also really concerned about a lot of the legislation that I'm seeing. I'm concerned that it's going to make it difficult for the health department to keep our drinking water safe, keep our air sheds safe, keep our water safe, keep our restaurants operating safely. I feel like there's a lot of knee-jerk legislative reaction to enforcement, and I'm just really hoping that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that we allow these professionals that have expertise to continue to do their job to keep us safe. That's my spiel for now.
Thank you, Anna, and yeah, thanks to the work of you and everyone in the office. I appreciate how hard it is. I'm going to turn to Tom Snyder now, one of the business owners on the ground here in Missoula who are coping with this new reality and all of the difficulties that it's brought. And then we'll turn to, after that, we'll turn to House Majority Leader Sue Vinton. But Tom, over to you.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me here. And it was great hearing what Anna had to say and Jim had to say. And I'm not a lawyer on this panel, so my goal is going to be to give a perspective of people's reactions and what I view as kind of the impossible middle ground that everyone is trying to play, like Anna with the health department. You know, for me, small businesses really have been at the intersection of the individual and the government's battle over rights and responsibilities. We've really become the witness to society's responsibility to one another and the changing dynamics that take place on both sides. And what we've seen across the state, having locations in Missoula, in Bozeman, Great Falls, and Billings, is that to us, it very much seems like legislation and restrictions have become a lagging indicator of case counts, because panicked individuals have more control over the virus. As case counts rise, people have more fear, they have more awareness, they have a rising responsibility, and then the community itself begins to sustain the protocol. Since March, this reaction to rising cases into a subsequent fall comes before and regardless of what restrictions are put in place or lifted. As a business, we closed our lobbies before it was required. We had our staff wear masks before it was mandatory. And in fact, we preceded all of Missoula County's orders and therefore the state orders like Anna talked about. We did this because the individual demanded it, and we had a responsibility to our customers' health and safety. Individuals had the responsibility to support the places that were engaged in conscious capitalism, but at that point, the right to choose otherwise, just as others had the right to not go into places with COVID protocols and vote on the community's direction with their dollars. Choice is a powerful thing, and what I've seen, and the thing that's been the most difficult, is when you take that choice away, you begin to politicize everything. You begin to politicize science. And as soon as you politicize science, you immediately begin to destroy good science. And we've seen this play out over and over again. You do it at a time that science has to be free flowing, and it has to be a transparent tool, and it has to be something that people can follow and should follow. Our federal and state officials, I think, have done a really good job, but they've been dealt an impossible task of protecting the dual mandate of public health and economic health. But the harmonization that was referenced before, to no fault of theirs, was mismanaged from the start. And it was mismanaged in a country that values personal freedom over all else. We needed a cohesive goal, and we needed an initial set of lockdowns and measures to act as a catalyst to encourage responsibility. But there was so much unknown at the beginning, and in hindsight, we really botched our chance at real containment. With lockdowns, with border controls, with mass testing, we didn't do a good job from the beginning. And now, to an extent, it feels like we're in this uncontrolled burn that's power cycling the economy all the way to vaccination and herd immunity with no clear goal, and a back and forth that feels more reactionary than sustainable. And small businesses and individuals and people's lives are caught in the middle of a really damaging political theater that you guys have heard this back and forth with some of the other panelists. Our rights and responsibilities are a balancing act, and I've yet to really see someone that suggests a sustainable and economic and public health plan that actually survives to the finish line. We talk about unity a lot in this country, especially over the last couple of months, and I've yet to see hardly any examples of that. One of the few examples that I've seen is the work actually that the Missoula Health Department has done with small businesses in our community. And I think that that's an example that should be taken forward, because it's done with open dialogue and it's done with understanding. It's done with the balancing act of what are some of the legal implications. As Jim said, does the government have the right to do this? Absolutely they do. Do people have the responsibility? They absolutely should. And this balancing and this harmonization, in my opinion, what we see on the ground, and everything I've said here is just an opinion on what I've witnessed. And that harmonization has not gone well until I think we started to have open dialogue. And I would really say that Anna and the health department has done an amazing job with that. And I really do appreciate it. So there's my viewpoints, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tom. Now we will turn to Representative Vinton, our House Majority Leader. So you're in the legislature at the top of many of these laws and seen about the state's response. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective from where you sit in Helena?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. The legislature's approach this year has obviously been a unique one. We first had to grapple with the idea of how we were going to meet and how we were going to do the work that we're charged with doing during these uncertain times. This actually has been the most accessible legislative session in Montana history. And I say that because having served in previous terms, we never had Zoom capability, and now we do. And citizens across the state can choose whether to appear in person, whether to submit testimony in writing, or whether to participate via Zoom. And those same opportunities are available to each and every legislator here in Helena. Obviously, we've had to carefully balance responsibility with our collective efforts to deal with this virus and to deal with it responsibly. And responsibility is really a key word here at the Capitol. We feel, and I speak for the majority, that Montanans have always taken personal responsibility seriously and always look out for our neighbors with respect. So many legislators are choosing to appear in person, others are choosing not to, but we all take our responsibility to represent those 10,000 citizens that sent us here to the very best of our ability. So vaccines are now being distributed, and we're doing our best to focus on the most vulnerable under the guidance of the CDC. And I know that the governor's office has worked diligently to obtain the needed number of vaccines, and that is, to my understanding, proceeding. We also, here at the legislature, we're looking forward, and we're dealing with everyday issues for Montanans, but also the specific issues that have come to light during this pandemic. Increased suicide rates, depression, student learning loss, and isolation, income and job loss. As a business owner, I'm keenly aware of the difficulties that many of my fellow small business owners are enduring because of the pandemic. We've had permanent business closures, and sadly, we've seen a rise in alcoholism and drug abuse. So these are issues, again, we may deal with these on a every biannual legislative session, but now there's more of a keen awareness of these problems that are rising to the surface. And so we're trying to be nimble in how we're working to meet the needs of our citizens. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Representative Vinton. And we will, I'm going to turn right to the questions because you all have better questions than I've come up with. So first, and I'm going to try to group them for efficiency, but keep them coming in as well. I'll try to stay on top of it. First, there's a question about the definition of emergency. I mentioned that. I'll just quickly clarify that. So there are two, at the federal level, Congress has passed the National Emergencies Act, which basically allows the president to declare an emergency, and Congress by resolution can cancel the emergency. And every 6 months, Congress has to review the emergency and has an opportunity to end the emergency. After a year, the president then can decide whether to continue it or not. The state has a separate emergency statute that piggybacks on any national emergency, but then also has a shorter period for governor review and some possibility, although subject to the fact that the legislature is usually not in session, of legislative cancellation. We'll turn to that also when we talk about next steps. But I wanted to bring in, I think particularly Anna and Representative Vinton and Tom on these questions, several questions from Keegan, Elizabeth, and an anonymous participant about the federal, state, and local administrations and how those overlay on the ground with respect to who has responsibility for enforcing the precautions against transmission, who has responsibility for ensuring the uniformity of vaccinations. We have more accountability at the local level, but that means that we have less uniformity. And I wonder if each of you could talk about how you're seeing that play out in terms of kind of who's in charge. Anna, do you want to start?
Sure. So, you know, when there were a number of governor directives last year, and the county attorneys were tasked with enforcing those, as well as local health departments. In Missoula, that was not that big of a deal because we had the same restrictions at the local level, which we're obviously tasked with enforcing also. So there was parity of enforcement. It was just a matter of the mechanism of enforcement, whether we were enforcing our local regulations or our state regulations. And frankly, it was easier for us to enforce our local regulations because there's a pretty clear path to doing that under state law. And it doesn't really matter whether there's an emergency declared at the federal or state level. For example, we were using isolation and quarantine prior to COVID to deal with the pertussis outbreak. There was no declared emergency of this outbreak. It was just an outbreak within our county. We honestly thought that we were going to see measles last year in Missoula County. And so we would have dealt with that using our Title 50 powers, whether there was a declared state or federal emergency.
Okay, good. So that is, so public, at the local level, you can proceed whether or not there's an emergency, but there are still both federal and state regulations on top of that. Tom, as a business owner, how do you figure out what you have to do? You've taken proactive steps, but there's this patchwork of overlapping demands. How do you know whose advice to follow and what really the law is for you?
In all honesty, it can be difficult at times. You know, I think that I'm one of the fortunate ones that I had time and I wasn't in store constantly trying to keep my business alive, and I could follow what was happening with these different rules and regulations and restrictions that go into place. You know, and you talked a little bit about, you know, different level of responsibility, federal, state, local level. You know, we saw a clear path when it came to stimulus on how those different levels play out. And, you know, I think that a shotgun approach to stimulus money was a great idea. And we learned our lesson from the 2008 collapse of taking too long and trying to be too directed, and we needed to get money into people's hands quickly. So I think that we did a good job initially on that. The state did a really, really good job, I felt, with slowing down how they gave money out, because the federal had done more of a shotgun approach. The state took a little bit more time and directed it where it was needed. I thought they did an amazing job. You know, when it comes to regulations, restrictions on COVID related items, it is hodgepodge on a local level, but I think that the local level has so much more information of what's happening locally. You know, it's very different what's happening in Billings and what's happening in Missoula. And we need to have that trust and faith in our local elected officials who we put forward to begin to make those judgment calls and engage the community. And I think too much of what happened was there was too many rules, there was too many conflicting viewpoints. There was never a sense of unity in the path that we were taking moving forward. And so it left it to become very political. And regardless of who actually had the authority, we had people on both sides that, you know, kind of turned into a mob on either direction. And I think on a local level, had local officials stepped up, you know, on the elected side sooner, quicker, and more vocally, we might have had some better reaction and better community buy-in. So we couldn't follow anything. Truly, we took the most restrictive stance in all of the communities. So as things got lifted in Billings or in Bozeman, we just continued acting responsibly and doing, you know, the most restrictive CDC recommendations. And I know that there's kind of that question of, well, will everyone act responsibly? I would hope that we're the majority of small businesses. There's going to be some people that don't, but those people, regardless of regulations, are not following the rules. And I think that most people do want to act responsibly. We just politicized it too much, so it threw a wedge in everything.
Well, thank you, Tom. And as some of the participants have noted, you know, businesses are just in a really tough spot with enforcing their own rules. It's quite a bit beyond no shirt, no shoes, no service anymore with this. So, Representative Vinton, you're also a small business owner. What is the legislature looking at this session to problem solve around some of these issues that we've heard about?
Thank you. You know, this is so timely because for those of you that have been following Senate Bill 65 in its journey through the legislature, we anticipate that Governor Gianforte is going to sign that bill as early as this afternoon. That bill offers protections to small businesses in particular, clarifies that business owners are not to be subject to civil liability for failing to verify that a person is wearing a mask, failing to verify that a mask is sufficient to stop the spread of COVID-19. It prohibiting people from entering a premises if the person refuses temperature checks, and also not requiring employers to demand that their customers receive a vaccine prior to entry. These are very important protections that are going to enable small businesses across the state to reopen and get back in business.
Thank you, Representative Vinton. And there are lots more questions about kind of lessons learned and where we go next, but I wanted to hear from Justice Nelson as well. One of the participants talks about is the waiver or limits on liability that businesses receive in exchange for following any particular set of guidelines consistent with the message of personal responsibility for business owners. Justice Nelson, do you have thoughts on, I know you've seen restrictions on liability and opined on them as a justice on the court. Do you have views on this or other areas of reforms or some of the problems we've been discussing?
Yeah, Anthony, thank you. Let me make 2 points here. Over the last X number of years, the rule of law in this country has really taken a hit. It seems that the rules and laws apply to everybody but somebody that doesn't want to obey the law. And what I'm getting at here is a lot of these problems are so solvable if our leaders in government simply follow the rules that they expect other people to follow. And they don't. They don't. We had 4 years and the previous administration at a federal level who put out that the COVID pandemic was a hoax and the news was fake and relied on false science and everything. The present administration seems to have taken this a lot more seriously. But in terms of our legislature, and I'm not trying to pick on legislators, they have a hard job to do. As Representative Vinton points out, they have a statutory governmental constitutional duty to perform. But we had an article in the Independent Record today, held in the newspaper. And a lot of small business owners are complaining, as at least the article pointed out, that legislators come into a restaurant, a place of business, no mask. And they're asked to put on a mask, and it's, I'm from the legislature, I don't have to do any of this stuff. And what I'm getting at is if our governmental leaders, both federal and state, simply set an example for people, I think we wouldn't have all these problems. I really don't, because people want to follow the people that are elected to public office to run the governments. And if those people don't follow the rules, if those people blow it all off, there's a substantial majority of our citizens who are going to blow it off as well. The president doesn't have to do it. If the House leaders don't have to do it. If these people don't have to do it, why do I have to do it? I don't. It's my right. Know my rights. As far as all these bills, Senate Bill 65, whatever, to limit liability, that's fine to the extent that if the government feels it's necessary to immunize businesses from suit, which is what this is all about, even though somebody may have a valid personal injury case or whatever. If that's what the government wants to do, I guess the government can do it. Those laws can be challenged in the Supreme Court, and we'll see how far it goes. But the problem is, all of Senate Bill 75, that's very welcomed by small businesses, and I can certainly appreciate, none of that addresses the problem of the pandemic that we're in. The pandemic is the problem that's closing businesses. People are out of work. They don't have jobs. They can't pay their rent. Not because of people getting sued, it's because of a disease out there that is making millions of people sick and hundreds of thousands of people in this country. Last check I saw was about 450,000 people have died from it. That's the problem. That's what we have to address. And until our government leaders start setting an example themselves, we're not going to get this solved. We're simply not. Because everybody knows their rights. Nobody can tell me to wear a mask. The hell with it. That's my thoughts on it.
So I wanted to-
Thank you.
yeah,
I
Tom.
feel like I need to
Oh,
respond
okay.
to that.
Yeah, why don't Representative Vinton, and then we'll bring Tom in for perspective on the ground on the limits of liability. Thank you, Representative Vinton.
Thank you. And with all due respect to Justice Nelson, I would say that dealing with this pandemic starts with personal responsibility. Each one of us chooses how we will act responsibly. And I think that the majority of us do. To paint legislative leaders as being irresponsible and bad examples is simply not true. I feel as though we are doing the very best we can to deal with some very widespread inconsistencies in dealing with this pandemic. What is happening in Lewis and Clark County can be some very different in a county in eastern Montana or western Montana. So we all deal with things as our community feels is best and how we as individuals feel is best. And I would say that the majority of us act in a very responsible way during a very difficult and challenging time.
Thank you, Representative Vinton. And Tom, you've talked about exactly what Representative Vinton is talking about. You're running businesses in different parts of the states with different community views and different individual views. How are you approaching the reforms coming from the legislature on liability, as well as that difficult task that Representative Vinton talks about, is that people just have different views on their risk tolerance for this?
You know, to be completely honest, I've not been following too closely what's happening on the legislative level, because I think what Jim said hits on a couple really important things that I've been witnessing over the last year. And I have no examples on a state level, but certainly on the federal level, on both sides, we see, you know, rules for thee and not for me. And we've had complete erosion of our civil discourse and our civil responsibility to one another. And we pin this battle against, you know, government control in small businesses and individuals, but we have to accept the reality. Like Jim said, we have a virus that is spreading like crazy. It's killing a lot of people. And regardless of restrictions and rules that the government puts in place, people will react accordingly. Businesses would be shut down. We would slow down. You know, if we didn't do lockdowns, if we didn't have any restrictions, our business would drop in revenue because of people's responses. And I think that's the part that we're really missing is this is about people. This is about information. This is about cohesion and how we communicate with one another, how we understand one another. And we are so polarized and so split up that we have an inability to get there and to recognize the situation that we're in and a path forward. And I think, you know, on a local level, that's where you have a benefit, because I can call up Anna and we can have a conversation of, I need this to keep my business alive. She needs this for public health. We both want the virus to go away and we both want to have an impact on mitigation. So how do we get there in a sustainable way? And so I thought Jim hit a few things, and really it's the erosion of any discourse and civility that has become more of a problem than anything, in my view.
There's still some more questions on the question of personal responsibility versus the responsibilities of government leaders and their communities, and wanted to give us another chance to take a beat on that. Anna, do you have thoughts on that or other follow-ups?
Yeah, I think we're personal responsibility. I really get that. I really understand that this is a civil liberties issue for people. And I just think that where it falls short is that you wear a mask to protect others. And so it seems like if you choose not to wear one, you are impacting others. And so that's where the personal responsibility piece doesn't quite logically connect for me. I do think, though, that one thing I'm seeing in a lot of the questions and in this conversation is really norms and the difference between norms and laws, right? And laws are pretty empty and meaningless if there are norms that are well established that are counter to those regulations or laws or whatever. And I think we all tend to be in agreement that this intense polarization and partisanship of these public health protections has created this diversion in norms that makes it very hard to regulate, because if you have these just deeply different ideas about the moral or philosophical approach to wearing a mask or whatever, necessarily you're going to have an almost impossible task of regulating that behavior because of that severe divergence of norms.
Thank you, Anna. I wanted to, it's about time to wrap up, but I wanted to provide any of the other panelists a chance to offer a last word here.
I know I just spoke, Anthony, but I just want to throw a shout out here. A few months ago, when it was a particularly difficult time at the health department, I brought a couple dozen donuts over to the health department. I hadn't been there in person for a long time, and it reminded me of solitary confinement units when I used to go to the state prison. It was like morale was low. And, you know, most of what the health department gets is a lot of hate and a lot of hostility and a lot of criticism. And so if anybody wants to send a shout out to the local health department about what a great job they're doing, it will be really welcome.
I agree with you, Anna. I can't support those people enough. We've had, again, in Lewis and Clark County, our county health person that's in charge. You know, it's hard to talk to her without her getting into emotional. I mean, she just is sick of people hating Neil, and you know, she's just a person trying to do her job, a public official. And if she got more support from our leadership, both at the federal level and the state level, I don't think her job would be nearly as difficult as it is.
So, well, I'd just like to wrap up. We're out of time, but I'd like to thank you, Justice Nelson, thank you, Anna Conley, Tom Snyder, Representative Vinton, especially Majority Leader Vinton, coming from the legislature. We know you're very busy there. And thank you to all of our participants for great questions. We only began to scratch the surface. Maybe we need to have more dialogues and continue the dialogues, and I know we will. I'm glad that Anna raised this question. Is there's only so much that law can do in establishing norms for conduct, and so much of what we're talking about are floors rather than ceilings in terms of what the law requires versus what each of us can do above that. So some of these are decisions we need to make together as a community. And those are the decisions that Anna and Representative Vinton are involved in right now. And I'd encourage you to participate in those discussions as you leave this dialogue. Finally, I'd like to end by talking about the reason we're having this wonderful series of dialogues. Dr. Anthony Fauci will be talking to us here at the University of Montana in the 2021 Mansfield Lecture, a conversation with Dr. Fauci, Wednesday, February 17th. At noon on Zoom. Go to the Mansfield Center website for details on that. Many of you had some interesting scientific questions, which as lawyers and business representatives and public officials we may not be able to answer, save those for Dr. Fauci. Again, thanks to the Mansfield Center. Thanks to all of you. Please stay safe. Continue this dialogue in your communities and with your public officials, and take care.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Dina.